The 1920s had been a decade of high energy and high hopes for America. But the spirit of a nation enjoying a new age of prosperity gave way to despair in the 1930s. The stock market crash of 1929 marked the beginning of the Great Depression, a global economic collapse that created an army of unemployed, disheartened, and hungry people. Looking for help, Americans elected Franklin D. Roosevelt as president in 1932. A confident and optimistic leader, Roosevelt provided courage to a country gripped by fear. He also expanded the role of government in American life by providing jobs to men such as these in the Civilian Conservation Corps, and by offering federal relief to the old, the needy, and the forgotten. Movies like this Hollywood musical spectacular were a popular escape from the hard times of the Depression. Films and music bolstered the sagging spirits of a nation in crisis. But by the late 1930s, though the most desperate days were over, many Americans were still without jobs, homes, or decent meals. Neither political remedies nor the patience of the people brought America completely out of the Depression. Symbols of Depression-era hardships, these street vendors sold apples for a nickel each. They encouraged people to buy an apple a day and eat the Depression away. President Herbert C. Hoover at center also tried to reassure the public. Hoover promised a rapid return to prosperity. But Hoover's optimism and concern for the people did little good. Thousands of businesses were forced to close and millions of workers were laid off. This fed the downward spiral of the Depression. Farmers struggled too, and many went bankrupt. They watched their land and livelihood disappear at public auctions like this one. For those who could not afford a decent place to live, home became a shack pieced together from scrap metal, wood, and cardboard boxes. Located on vacant lots, shanty towns like this one were called Hoovervilles, because many people blamed President Hoover for the hard times of the Depression. These children lived in a Hooverville in Washington, D.C., where in 1932 their fathers and thousands of other unemployed World War I veterans had gathered on the steps of the Capitol. Congress had promised to pay these veterans a bonus for their wartime service, but not until 1945. Without jobs and with little money, these veterans, known as the Bonus Marchers, demanded the bonus be paid right away. Riots erupted between the veterans and police, and President Hoover directed the United States Army to restore order. Using tanks, bayonets, and tear gas, the Army then drove the Bonus Marchers out of Washington. It was not until 4 years later that Congress agreed to their demands. By 1932, unemployment had skyrocketed to almost 25%. With empty stomachs and empty pockets, Americans felt hopeless. Franklin Roosevelt, governor of New York and the Democratic nominee for president in 1932, offered hope to the majority of Americans. Roosevelt came to believe that the federal government should provide extensive relief to help the common man. Proposing a new role for government and a new deal for the American people, Roosevelt won a landslide victory over Hoover. Roosevelt's greatest achievement was to restore almost single-handedly America's hope and courage. In his inaugural address, Roosevelt declared his faith in the future.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Fear had helped create economic panic. By early 1933, many banks had failed, and many who had lost confidence in the banking system rushed to withdraw their money. One of Roosevelt's first actions in office was to close the banks for a brief period and reassure the nation in a radio speech. The tactic worked. Americans put their money back in the banks when they reopened. During his first 100 days in office, Roosevelt pushed a record number of bills through Congress as part of his program for national recovery. The centerpiece of Roosevelt's program was the National Recovery Administration, or NRA. It encouraged a minimum wage and an 8-hour workday to prevent exploitation of workers desperate for jobs. Businesses that cooperated could display the NRA Blue Eagle and expect the patronage of patriotic citizens. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, provided more than 2.5 million jobs to unemployed youth. CCC workers, shown here planting trees, also built reservoirs and helped develop and preserve the nation's parks and forests. Farmers needed help too. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was designed to raise the price of farm products by limiting supply. It provided federal payments to farmers like this one who destroyed their crops and did not plant new ones. But while farmers plowed under crops, thousands of hungry Americans waited in bread lines for meals. Roosevelt reached out to the nation in a series of radio speeches called Fireside Chats. His simple words and soothing voice helped him establish a sense of intimacy and friendship with the American people. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt traveled to many places the president, who was handicapped by polio, could not. She visited this coal mine in Ohio to gather information about working conditions. Eleanor Roosevelt frequently spoke out to help laborers, young people, women, and minorities. When singer Marian Anderson was refused the right to perform at a concert in Washington, D.C. because she was black, Eleanor Roosevelt championed her cause. Roosevelt resigned from the Daughters of the American Revolution, the organization that had barred Anderson's performance at Constitution Hall, and helped arrange for a substitute performance here at the Lincoln Memorial. Nature also played a part in the bleak days of the Depression. A combination of drought, high winds, and poor soil conservation turned the southern Great Plains into what became known as the Dust Bowl, where clouds of sand and soil darkened the skies. Farm families like this one were portrayed by author John Steinbeck in his Pulitzer Prize-winning novel The Grapes of Wrath. He told the story of the Dust Bowl and the people who packed their few possessions and headed west. On the highways, Steinbeck wrote, the people moved like ants and searched for work, for food. Some, like Senator Huey Long of Louisiana, seen here gesturing at reporters, blamed President Roosevelt for the hard times. Huey Long believed that Roosevelt's New Deal was the same old deal for most Americans. Long and others reflected a growing unhappiness with the federal government. As pictured in this cartoon, Uncle Sam, critics believed, was tied down by Congress and New Deal agencies such as the CCC and NRA. These agencies, critics felt, were making it impossible for Uncle Sam to get on his feet again after the economic collapse. But most Americans still supported President Roosevelt and his legislative parade. The Social Security Act of 1935 promised a pension to older Americans, as well as protection for the unemployed and the needy. The Federal Art Project placed artists on the government payroll. Painters created murals celebrating the working man, while workers celebrated one of their greatest legislative victories, the passage in 1935 of the National Labor Relations Act. The law protected a worker's right to join a union and required management to bargain with elected union representatives. The passage of the National Labor Relations Act and other New Deal labor legislation was closely supervised by Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor. Appointed by President Roosevelt, she was the first woman to hold a position in the president's cabinet. Before workers could claim their newly won rights, however, they had to confront management. By staging a sit-down strike inside General Motors plants and refusing to leave, these auto workers forced reluctant industry management to recognize their union, the United Auto Workers. But in spite of labor victories and this billboard's optimistic message, the hard times were not over. Many men and women were still without jobs. Roosevelt's ambitious program could not cure all the people's woes. But in another way, and at least for a few hours, movies sometimes seem to. Though the radio was a great source of entertainment, movies also became a great escape for millions of Americans. Leaving their worries outside the theater doors, audiences could enter a world of romance and elegance. Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers swept across the screen with style and grace, while Walt Disney captivated millions with his first full-length animated feature film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The Wizard of Oz was another fantasy film that helped relieve the cares of a troubled nation. And comic book hero Buck Rogers transported his readers to other galaxies. Monopoly, a game of real estate speculation still popular today, brought fortune or failure with a roll of the dice. But not all the romance and adventure was fantasy. Music also eased people's troubles. By the late 1930s, ballrooms had become showcases for a new kind of music called swing. The big band era dawned. And its leading light was Benny Goodman. With his clarinet and his orchestra, Goodman was idolized as the king of swing. The king shared the spotlight with Count Basie, and Basie and his orchestra were often accompanied by blues singer Billie Holiday. Her velvety voice and powerful lyrics created some of the most personal and emotional music of the 30s. Jesse Owens was another famous figure of the decade. Standing above the competition, Owens was the first American to win 4 gold medals in track and field in one Olympic year. As a black athlete at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, Germany, Owens challenged the racism spread by Adolf Hitler, leader of Germany's Nazi Party. Hitler and his followers held that Germans belonged to a superior race. Hitler used nationalism and racism to rally crowds and exploit the desperation of his countrymen. Many Germans, like many Americans, were unemployed. Hitler encouraged Germans to find scapegoats for their problems. Nazi soldiers like this one rounded up Jews and harassed them. Hitler blamed the Jews for Germany's economic problems and believed that Germans were destined to dominate all of Europe. By 1939, Nazi tanks had rolled into Czechoslovakia and Poland, and World War II had begun. But most Americans preferred to read the headlines rather than rally troops and fight another European war. They were more concerned about the continued economic slump at home, where unemployment remained high. Roosevelt's New Deal provided a democratic response to the Great Depression, but it failed to restore prosperity completely in peacetime. Unfortunately, it would take World War II to finally end the Depression. Preparation for war provided new jobs for workers, like these men changing shifts at a shipyard, and brought the American economy back to life.